This video features stanza by stanza paraphrase of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem Dejection and Ode. So we begin with the first stanza now. The poet Coleridge begins the ode by referring to the poet who wrote the ballad of Sir Patrick Spens. If this poet was a reliable prophet of weather, that means the poet who wrote the ballad of Sir Patrick Spens, insofar as to be believed that the sight of the old moon in the arms of the new portends stormy weather, this night, which is so calm just now, is bound to be stirred by winds that are blowing more violently here than the winds that are shaping the distant clouds into large, fleecy tufts of snow, or than that gasping current of air which is complaining and sweeping over the strings of the Aeolian lute. It would have been much better if the lute were silent. The new moon shines brightly. It is covered with an unearthly light. It is a sort of floating ethereal light and is encircled by a bright thread of light. The poet Coleridge says that he can see the old moon in the circular disk of the new. It predicts the coming of rain and the blowing of violent gusts of wind. Even now the gusts of wind are increasing in violence and intensity. Showers of rain are falling in a slanting manner and are both loud and fast. The sound of the wind and storm, which have often elevated the poet's soul in the past and have made his imagination roam abroad, might perhaps give their usual impetus to his soul tonight. They might revive the poet's sense of failure and frustration as a poet and even intensify it. The sorrow from which the poet suffers is unattended by pain. It is an ineffectual kind of sorrow. It is dark and dismal. It is a sort of choked up, sleepy, feelingless sorrow which refuses to find an expression and get some relief thereby into words, sighs, or tears. Then the poet calls out to his sweetheart. He says that in this vacant and feelingless mood, and entertaining different thoughts from those of the distant singing thrush, the poet has been looking at the sky in the west and at its peculiar yellow-green color. The poet is still looking at the sky and he is still staring at it with a blank look. The poet looks at those thin clouds worked up into flakes and streaked with bars. These clouds, by moving themselves, make the stars move behind or between them. Sometimes these stars look very bright and sometimes very dim, but they can be seen all the time. The distant new moon is fixed to its place and it appears as it grows where it is shining now. The poet sees all these objects of nature which are so exceedingly beautiful, but he is not moved or stirred to his depths by their beauty. The poet says that he no longer feels jovial and mirthful. The sight of the beautiful objects of nature cannot cure the sorrow in his heart by lifting the stifling weight of grief from off his mind. It would be a fruitless attempt even though he should go on looking at that green light which is still staying out in the west. The poet cannot expect external objects of nature to inspire him because the sources of poetic inspiration lie within the mind or the soul of a person. Thus, if the mind is paralyzed, no amount of external objects, however beautiful, can inspire the poet. The poet calls out to his beloved Sarah and says that we human beings interpret nature by our own moods and whims. We ourselves attribute emotions and feelings to inanimate objects of nature. We invest nature with beauty and color when we are in a happy mood, and we invest it with gloom and sorrow when we are dejected or depressed. If we read a deeper or inner meaning into nature, the inner meaning is deposited into nature by ourselves, for it is not revealed by the lifeless and cold nature to the feelingless and over-anxious common man. The higher or spiritual meaning that we pretend to read into nature only proceeds from our own soul. The light, the splendor, the beautiful brightness with which we invest nature come from within our own soul and are meant to wrap up the different objects of nature. Similarly, the poetic inspiration also proceeds from the soul of the poet. It is nothing but a sweet and powerful echo of the soul, and it is in itself is the very soul and essential component of all sweet sounds like music and poetry. Next, the poet addresses his beloved Sarah again. He remarks that she is innocent and spotless. She need not ask him what poetic inspiration is like or where its abode is. It is a light, a splendor, a mist which is not only beautiful in itself but which enables the poet to create beauty. It is given to poets in their most sublime moments. It is the very soul of life. In fact, it is the very stream from which life flows. It is vague as well as beneficial. It is a pure joy. It is a spirit and a power which nature gives to the poets when nature and the poets work in perfect harmony. It is a dowry or gift bestowed by nature on the poets. By virtue of possessing this power, the poets enjoy the vision of a new earth and a new heaven, a vision which cannot be imagined by those who delight in pleasure of the sense and who are proud. The poets take delight in their poetic faculties or poetic inspiration. From the poetic inspiration flow all the fine arts that captivate the ear or the eye. All music is nothing but a reverberation of poetic exaltation, and all the colors used by the painters in painting are colored or influenced by it. Then the poet says that in the past, though he had to face many difficulties, yet on account of possessing poetic imagination, he did not mind sorrow. His sorrows were in fact the material out of which his imagination created beautiful dreams of happiness for him. The poet was hopeful, he was optimistic, he was encircled by thoughts of hope, just as a tree is encircled by a creeper. Blessings and joys which eluded him still seemed to be within his grasp. But now misfortunes crush him completely. However, the poet does not mind the loss of his jolly self. But what the poet minds the most is that each visit of misfortune and mental depression annuls or suspends what nature bestowed on him at the time of his birth. His poetic faculty or imaginative sensibility has been suspended. The poet realizes his helplessness in not being able to exercise what he feels strongly. He is compelled to be silent and resign himself to the loss of his poetic faculty. Coleridge fears that the increasing interest that he is taking in profound metaphysics or philosophy would kill the poet in him one day. Yet the poet stresses that by nature he is a poet and not a metaphysician. His poetic faculty was his only stock or treasure, but metaphysics, which best suits intellect or intellectual faculties, has now infected the whole of his being. The metaphysical way of thinking has become a second nature with him. The consequence is that the poet is now incapable of experiencing a poetic or emotional rapture. Therefore, leaving aside tormenting and biting thoughts which oppress his mind and which makes the poet realize the unpleasant reality of his failure as a poet, Coleridge turns to listen to the noise made by the wind which has been howling for a long time unnoticed by him. The poet reminds the wind that it should blow on bare rocks, mountainous lakes, or a withered tree, or through a thick group of pine trees never climbed by a forester, or through a haunted house which has been the abode of witches for a long time, rather than on the lute lying in the window of the poet's room. These things, he suggests, are more suitable instruments for the wind to blow upon than the lute. The poet says that the wind is a mad lute player because in the rainy season it makes the weather intensely cold and making Christmas stormy and tumultuous. The poet Coleridge also says that the wind is a perfect actor because it can imitate all the human tragic sounds. The wind is a powerful poet in itself because it can express every human sound. The wind is bold to the point of being mad. Just now, the wind seems to imitate the sound of a defeated army retreating in a disorderly manner. The wind seems to imitate perfectly the shrieks of trampled soldiers who are crying on account of the severe wounds they have received in the battlefield. They seem to be crying with pain, all of them together, while shivering in the cold outside. But the next moment, there is silence in the air. There is a pause of the most profound silence. It seems that all the noise of the retreating army, accompanied by cries and shivering, have vanished. The wind now imitates the sound of some other human being in a softer and less loud manner. It is a story of lesser fear, and it is mitigated by delightful pathos. It is as charming as a charming song composed by Thomas Otway, who wrote 3 great tragedies himself. Next, the poet is imitating the sound of a small child who has lost her way in a lonely forest, which is located near her home. The child seems to cry softly, sometimes out of fear and poignant sorrow, and sometimes shrieks loudly in order to attract the attention of her mother. In the last stanza of the ode, the poet points out that it is midnight now. He has little inclination to go to bed. However, the poet prays that his beloved Sarah might never have to keep awake at night like him. He prays that the gentle sleep would visit his beloved Sarah with its balmy and soothing charm. The poet also wishes and prays that this storm be confined to the mountain which has given birth to it and may now blow over the house of his sweetheart. The poet prays that all the stars might shine brightly above Sarah's house and that they might shine so serenely and silently as if they are watching the sleeping earth. The poet wishes that his beloved Sarah would rise from her sleep in the morning in a cheerful frame of mind. He prays that bright thoughts, cheerful looks, and joy elevate her soul, and also prays that joy would make her voice musical. He prays that all nature always appear to his beloved to be full of joy and beauty, and he also prays that her living soul be surrounded by all the pleasures of life. The poet calls out to his beloved Sarah and says that she is an innocent spirit who is guided by heaven. She is the most pious friend of the poet. He prays that she should enjoy constant and eternal happiness and that sorrow should never invade her heart. Dejection and Ode ends here. Do check out my previous video which contains a critical summary of this poem Dejection and Ode. Let me know if you would like me to make a question and answer video on this poem. Until the next time we meet again, bye.